Welcome to the Happier Lives Institute's Wellbeing course. In this course, we are going to cover why measuring well-being is important, the history of well-being, how we measure it and what the WELLBY is, whether we can trust measures of well-being, some common questions we often get about well-being, how we translate well-being data into cost effectiveness, and finally, practical tips for implementing well-being data collection. So let's talk about your questions in video 4. Over the years, we've identified some issues that come up regularly about using and measuring happiness data. And we get it. It is a strange new concept. And the reason we're making this video series is exactly because we know it's a strange, unfamiliar concept and we want to help people understand the issues. Hopefully this video will answer some questions you already have and maybe some you haven't thought of yet. And with this information, you can understand what we're doing better, and also you can take this information to potential donors or stakeholders and answer their issues too. So if well-being is such a good idea, how come no one else is using it? Well, actually many groups and academics are already using subjective well-being measures. There are 37 governments worldwide that gather life satisfaction or some other well-being measure from their citizens, and this has really picked up in the last decade or so. We're at the cutting edge here. The UK was one of the first countries to do this, and the UK only started collecting national data in 2011. Although the Happier Lives Institute was the first to evaluate charities in terms of well-being impact, we are not alone. There are organisations like the State of Life and pro bono economics that also help charities, policymakers and for-profit organisations create well-being based evaluations. Well-being research has exploded in academia in recent years. Between 2003 and 2022, the number of publications with titles or abstracts containing words like happiness, life satisfaction, satisfaction with life or subjective well-being has grown by a factor of 10. On the policy side, the UK and New Zealand Treasuries have adopted WELLBYs for policy design and evaluation, and there are now a team of academics, notably at the London School of Economics, who are working on figuring out in practice which policies are good value for money if you're putting well-being first. So oddly, the UK is actually a world leader in happiness research, not actual happiness sadly, but we're working on that. And well-being metrics are no longer some fringe idea. They're rapidly catching up and getting the rightful position that they should have had all along. Okay, so what about things like saving lives? The WELLBY, you can see it as a bit like a train. It's very powerful on its tracks, but it's a bit difficult to travel beyond them. In particular, the well-being approach is very powerful for making evidence-based comparisons between different ways to improve quality of life. And there are extra complications in using the WELLBY to compare improving lives to saving lives. I want to emphasise this is not just a problem for the well-being approach. If you measure quality of life with changes to income, you'd still be scratching your head about how good some improvements to income are compared to saving a life. I mean, how do you trade those off? So the questions like when is a life worth living are tricky, fraught, philosophical issues, whatever you're trying to measure. I'll give you a concrete example of how this applies in the well-being case. So say someone's life is extended by a year and they are 6 out of 10 in life satisfaction. How many WELLBYs is that? Is that 6 WELLBYs per year? If that's so, it means we've set the neutral point, the place where life is neither good nor bad, at 0 out of 10. But what's odd about that is it means that no life, even one of absolute misery, can ever be bad for someone, because people can't report minus numbers. 0 out of 10 is the lowest. So maybe we say the neutral point is 5 out of 10, in which case extending a life for 1 year is worth 1 WELLBY rather than 6. And suddenly this means the intervention is 1/6 as effective, even though none of the other facts have changed. So you can sort of see the complexities. There are further issues on the Epicurean view of death, named after the Greek philosopher Epicurus. Death isn't good or bad for us. We can't really compare it to life because once we're dead, we won't know if we're dead. And how can anything be good or bad for us if we don't exist? Another perspective is that we often think it's more valuable to save the life of a 20-year-old rather than a 1-year-old, even though the 1-year-old would experience more total well-being if they lived. So you can see how there are these kind of difficult, tricky philosophical issues in here, which are going to change how you do the comparisons. And in the Happy Lives Institute, we don't have an organisational view on what the right is. We're just sort of surfacing some of the issues and the choice points. If you want to dig deeper, you can check out our Elephant in the Bed Net report, which gets into this in more detail. These are important open questions about how to apply the wellbeing approach, and we don't claim we figured this out. Any attempt to do impact measurement will run into it. We can either recognise the issues and try and do something about them, or we can just pretend they're not there. So we focus on well-being work, but one question we get quite a lot is, well, what about animals and what about the environment? And those are currently quite complex and out of scope. So we often say to people that we'll measure animal well-being when we've worked out how to make animals talk. It's a sort of a limitation of self-reported measures that we can't easily do the comparisons there. And we often get people who ask us how we compare interventions that impact humans now in the next few years to environmental interventions, which will have very diffuse impacts that will occur in years or decades. So in principle, the answer is fairly straightforward. You'd want to estimate the impacts of the environmental interventions, what they have on well-being further on, and then compare that to the near-term direct impact interventions. So you just want to count up the total amount of well-being. That's one way you could do it. But in practice, it's really quite complicated, as you need to rely on things like complex climate models, which are often quite speculative, and you have to make other assumptions. So it would feel like quite an apples to oranges comparison, where one would be quite evidence-based and the other you'd have to be putting more of your assumptions into it. So it's not impossible, but it's currently out of scope of what we're trying to do here. If we found a funder that really wanted us to look into it, we would, but otherwise it's not something that we have capacity for. There are organisations that think about animal environmental charities that you might be interested, organisations like Animal Charity Evaluators or Giving Green. And I should add that they also don't try and compare interventions in their area against those affecting people directly. What about QALYs and DALYs? So QALYs are quality adjusted life years and DALYs are disability adjusted life years. And these are both standard health metrics used in global development, policy making, and have been used quite a lot for the last couple of decades. So one QALY is the equivalent of 1 year in perfect health. So if an intervention extends someone's life for 5 years, but leaves them in a condition that reduces their quality of life to 0.5 on the 0 to 1 scale, that intervention has an impact of 2.5 QALYs. The DALY works in reverse. It measures years of healthy life lost to disease or disability. So why can't we just use these health metrics instead? Why do we need something new? We see there are two problems. So one is that QALYs and DALYs capture health, and there are things that matter besides health, like income, social cohesion, leisure time, relationships. I think all of us would say that health is important for a good life, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find people who say that health is the only thing that matters for a good life. The second problem is that QALYs and DALYs rely on people's guesses, not lived experience. QALYs and DALYs generally involve asking healthy people to predict how bad disabilities or illnesses would be. But when we compare the guesses used to calculate QALYs to real-life well-being data from people living with those conditions, we find they're quite different. In particular, people overestimate how bad physical disabilities will be and underestimate the impact of mental health conditions. For example, in a UK study found that people were willing to give up about 15% of their remaining life expectancy to avoid both some problems walking around, so having a limp, and moderate anxiety or depression. But when we ask people with those conditions, they find that those with depression experience about a 10 times bigger drop in their well-being than those who have some mobility issues. But people think they're just as bad. So this is why we prefer WELLBYs. It captures how people with conditions actually feel. I mean, you wouldn't trust a restaurant review from someone who never ate there, so why would you trust quality of life ratings from people who have never lived with those conditions? So why don't we just focus on income and let people make up their own minds, make their own choices? So some argue that the best way to help people is simple. You just help them become wealthier and then they can decide what to do. So in particular, we think that cash transfers to very poor people are a really powerful intervention. Our own research finds they are good at improving well-being and one of the best ways. But are these always the best way to improve people's well-being? We don't think necessarily they are. Okay, so here's why. First, people are not always rational maximisers of their well-being, and this is kind of obvious. People don't always purchase the best things which are the best things for their well-being. This can be due to a lack of information or because we're bad at guessing how things will affect us. So for instance, when I was in Sub-Saharan Africa doing a site visit to one of our top charities, Strong Minds, I met a woman who said that she was initially disappointed because she thought Strong Minds was going to give her cash. But after therapy, she said she was very glad she got therapy instead of the money because she never would have guessed how much it would change her life. And it was actually quite moving. So to be clear, it's not that poverty alleviating interventions that people waste the money. Studies show that time and time again that it is well spent. But it's a question about whether it has the impact that people expect it does. And so that's why we think there are organisations which can be more cost effective than straightforward cash transfers. Also, secondly, some things aren't really for sale. The thing that would actually make a big difference to your life, you simply can't pay for. So giving someone a cash transfer won't really help them get rid of poisonous lead in products, which is what one of our charities, Pure Earth, does. And charities like Strong Minds and Friendship Bench deliver psychotherapy in countries where you typically cannot go out and buy those things for yourself. So sometimes there's reason to provide services which aren't available normally. So the idea that poverty alleviation and just giving people cash is the right thing to do, that's a testable idea. And we don't deny that tackling poverty is a good way to make a big difference. But does it make the biggest difference? If what we really care about is how people feel in their own lives, we can test this using evidence. And in fact, we can run different interventions head to head, comparing the cost effectiveness at improving well-being and see what works best. And indeed, this is exactly what we've been doing for the last 6 years with a number of well-being analyses. So we find that there are a number of interventions which are more impactful per dollar than direct cash transfers. These include things like tackling depression, lead exposure, and malnutrition, all of which we've estimated are several times more cost effective than cash transfers. So I should emphasise that we don't really have a horse in this race. We just care about making people's lives better, and we're open-minded about how best to do that. And we think that the power of the well-being tools is that they can help us work out what's really working. Can you use WELLBYs for long-term and systemic changes? We occasionally get people who worry that the problem with the wellbeing approach is that it only lets us look at short-term interventions and it can't be used to assess wide systemic changes. The opposite of systemic interventions we call atomic interventions. We actually don't think either of these worries are justified. We have already evaluated programs with long-term payoffs. WELLBYs are more than capable of capturing long-term benefits to individuals, and we've used them for this purpose. You just have to find studies with enough information. So this is about modelling the right thing, having the right information, not about the WELLBY itself. So in our reports on parenting programs, these impact children well into adulthood, and then we've got lead exposure programs that can alter a child's development and affect its whole life path. You just need to find the right kind of information. In economics, it's typical to engage in pure time discounting, where you say that an event that happens in a year's time is worth less than one happens today, even if you are certain that both will happen. We don't use temporal discounting in our estimates, but we might consider that in the future. We have explored and recommended systemic change organisations. There's no problem in principle there. So, for instance, recently we had an evaluation of Pure Earth, which is a charity aimed at changing government policies on lead pollution. We also looked at the benefits of immigration reform. The estimates are necessarily more uncertain here, as you have to speculate more about the effects, like what's the chance this advocacy programme works, and if it does work, what impact will it have? But the challenges of assessing long-term and systemic changes are problems that apply in general. It's not a particular problem if you're focusing on well-being. Okay, so what are the drawbacks of using well-being? It's not a silver bullet. We don't want to pretend that it is. Like any measure, it has its limitations. And so I said earlier that the well-being analysis is a bit like a train. It's very powerful, but it does have its limitations. We talked about issues comparing life-improving to life-saving analysis, about comparing animals to humans, thinking about the long-run effects and the systemic effects where you've got to make some more assumptions. But there is a couple of other things you might want to think about as well. So firstly, looking at well-being is sort of incomplete by itself. Returning to our F1 analogy from the first video, although F1 teams would be lost if they didn't measure lap time, they would be equally lost if that was the only thing they measured. In terms of charities and policymakers understanding what's making a difference, you still need to record the data from those lower rungs of the data hierarchy: inputs, outputs, outcome measures, because that's what you look at to see what's going to have a change in your eventual impact. Another concern is that wellbeing data is a bit noisy. So people's life satisfaction scores can jump around more than your income or your health metrics. So one week you're 8 out of 10, the next week it rains, you have an argument with your partner, suddenly you're a 6 out of 10. So it can make it a bit hard to know exactly what's causing the change. It might be unrelated, or it might be part of some trial or intervention you're running. But this noise isn't fatal, you just need more data. With a big enough sample, the ups and downs from random bits of life will cancel each other out. For each person having a particularly good day, you'll have someone else having a particularly bad day. And the average still tells a story, you just need enough voices in the choir. That said, if you're a small organisation delivering an intervention with only a small effect size to just a handful of beneficiaries, wellbeing data might not be right for you, at least yet, because within the small sample, the true effect could get lost in the noise. Now, our analysts at the Happy Lives Institute can run what we call a power analysis to estimate the sample size a particular charity will need to identify the true effect of their programme. Basically, the bigger the individual effect size, the smaller the sample needed. However, as a rule of thumb, we would say that if you don't have the capacity to survey at least 500 beneficiaries, you might want to stick to more stable traditional measures to account for the noise. And if you are surveying 500 people, then you can just add in your wellbeing question and Bob's your uncle. So the third thing is that wellbeing is a new concept, and that can be a bit of a double-edged sword. Not everyone will know what a WELLBY is, that's why you've got to go and tell them. Some donors may raise an eyebrow while you're talking about it, ask how it's calculated and whether it really works, but I think you should take that as a good thing. If donors are asking you these sorts of questions, then they're engaged. And if you have taken an informative wellbeing course led by a leading wellbeing organisation, then you will be armed with the answers to those questions and be able to wow donors with a fascinating new idea that will keep you memorable and help you stand out from the crowd. So leading with a big idea backed by real evidence can make you memorable and show that you're a cutting-edge organisation. So do take happiness seriously. So when isn't wellbeing right? Well, if you've only got a few people to survey, if you're reliant on small donors and not chasing major ones, if you're not focused on improving quality of life, then wellbeing might not be right for you. But we think for lots of charities, adding wellbeing data gives you a clear understanding of your impact and a smart way to talk about it. So hopefully this has cleared up some of the biggest questions you would have about wellbeing measurement and its uses. We've looked at who else uses wellbeing, how it's the new coming thing, the complications around saving lives for whatever you're measuring, and how HLI looks at that. We mentioned some challenges with comparing improving lives to things like looking at animal-based charities, the environment, looking over the longer run. We looked at why QALYs and DALYs, traditional health metrics, don't really cut it. They don't allow us to measure what matters, and why just focusing on livelihoods isn't always going to really get what matters either. And then we looked at the drawbacks of wellbeing measures and who they are not appropriate for. If you still have a question, you can feel free to check out our website and reach out to us. If you can't find what you want on the website, you can email us at hello@happylivesinstitute.org, and we would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you. See you in the next video.